The time is over. Yes. Recite fourth kalima with English meaning.
جعل كلمة توحيد لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له له الملك وله الحمد يحيي ويميت وهو Could I start all over again?
Yes.
جعل كلمة توحيد لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له له الملك وله الحمد يحيي ويميت وهو حي لا يموت أبدا أبدا ذو الجلال والإكرام بيده الخير وهو على كل شيء قدير.
Sorry, beta, the time is over. Just suppose Zakir uncle gave you something. So what you have said when he gave something, and one more thing, same time you took or you heard a very good news. So what are dua that you have to say at that time?
Jazakallah and mashallah.
Subhanallah. You're right. Okay, they have done 5 right. Recite Ayatul Kursi.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الله لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم لا تأخذه سنة ولا نوم له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض من ذا الذي يشفع عنده إلا بإذنه يعلم ما بين أيديهم وما خلفهم ولا يحيطون بشيء من علمه إلا بما شاء وسع كرسيه السماوات والأرض ولا يؤوده حفظهما وهو العلي العظيم.
MashaAllah, right answer. Hafiz Sahab beside me started a journey by car, and when he reached at his house, so he did one dua. So what are those 2 dua that he have done while this timing?
Can you repeat the question?
Hafiz Sahab was traveling by car. So what is that dua that he has done before he started his journey? And when he reached at his house, he has done once again another dua. So what are those 2 dua that he has done?
Before starting the journey, he read Subhanalladhi sakhkhara lana hadha wa ma kunna lahu muqrinin wa inna ila rabbina lamunqalibun. And when he reached the house, he read Assalamu alaikum, or the other dua, which is Allahumma inni as'aluka khayra al-mawlaji wa khayra al-makhraji wa bismillah walajna wa bismillah kharatna wa ala Allahi rabbina tawakkal.
MashaAllah, Subhanallah, right answer. Recite 4th kalima with its English meaning.
جعلهم كلمة توحيد لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له له الملك وله الحمد يحيي ويميت وهو حي لا يموت أبدا أبدا ذو الجلال والإكرام بيده الخير وهو على كل شيء قدير. There is no God but Allah. He is one. None is his partner. His is the server.
The time is over, sorry. While I was looking in the mirror, I was just doing a dua. Same time, I was wearing a cloth. So, what are those 2 dua that I have done in this period?
Allahumma anta hasan da khalqi fasan khalqi. And when you are wearing the clothes, Alhamdulillah allati kasani ma wari bihi awrati wa tajammalu bihi fi ayati.
Great, right answer. I ate at my home and then I went somewhere else, someone's house. So I ate over there too. So what are those two dua that I have to do?
Like after finishing your meals,
Before and after.
before eating at your house, you have to say Bismillah wala barakatillah. And then after finishing the meal, you have to say Alhamdulillah alladhi atamana waskana wajalan minal muslimin. And at someone's house, you also have to say Bismillah wala barakatillah. And when you're finishing the meal, you have to say Allahumma barik lahum fima razaqtam waqfir lahum warhamhum.
MashaAllah, right. Okay. Can you please just tell us what are fara'id in wudu?
There are 4 faraid in wudu. They are washing the face, washing the full face once, washing the arms up to the elbow, and including the elbow once, doing massage to 1/4 of the head once, and washing the feet up to and including the ankles.
Subhanallah, right answer. MashaAllah. Which date in Islamic month was our Holy Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam born on the earth and he passed away from the earth? Day, date and Islamic month. When and where?
He was born on Monday 12th Rabiul Awwal 570 AD, and he passed away on Monday 12th Rabiul Awwal 633 AD.
Twenty seconds left.
Can you repeat the question?
When and where Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was born and he passed away, what was the day and date and Islamic month?
He was born in Makkah al-Mukarramah and passed away in Madinah al-Munawwarah.
Right answer. Yeah, so mashallah, you have done 6 correct out of 10 and they have done 5 correct out of 10, so you are winner. Mashallah. Okay. Congratulations, beta.
Class 6, start with class
Mashallah. Really, both group have done very nice job. Since this is the competition, sometime something happened that would not be in your mind.
Okay, let's go. Come on, who's that?
Class 6, please come forward. Class 6, please come forward so that we can call one by one the group. उनका question है sir. Yeah? Okay.
Who's your next partner? Why? Go call Mahek, please.
Mahat Chariwala, please. Can you come? Hurry up, because we have your group started. Okay, so first group is Mubashira and Zeba. So the question will be asked to you first. So the first question is, what is the name of first prophet on the earth?
Hazrat Adam alayhi salam.
Right. What is the date of birth of Holy Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and when and where he was born?
Our Holy Prophet ﷺ was born in Makkah al-Mukarramah on Monday 12 Rabiul Awal 570 AD.
MashaAllah. What are 12 Islamic months and what is the month in which we go for Hajj?
Muharram, Safar, Rabiul Awal, Rabiul Thani, Jamadil Awal, Jamadil Thani, Rajab, Shaban, Ramadan, Shawwal, Dhulqa'dah, Zilhajj. And the month that we go for Hajj is Zilhajj.
MashaAllah, right answer. What is the name of our Holy Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's mother and foster mother?
Our Holy Prophet ﷺ's mother is Sayyidah Amina radiallahu ta'ala anha, and our Holy Prophet ﷺ's foster mother's name was Sayyidah Halima Sadiya radiallahu ta'ala anha.
MashaAllah, right. When Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's father and his mother and his grandfather passed away from this world?
Can you please repeat the question?
When Sayyidina Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's father and his mother and his grandfather passed away from this world?
Our Holy Prophet ﷺ's father passed away several weeks before his birth, and our Holy Prophet ﷺ's mother passed away when our Holy Prophet ﷺ was 6 years old, and our Holy Prophet ﷺ's grandfather passed away when he was 8 years old.
Yes, right. MashaAllah. Yeah. You can ask always for clarification, okay? What is the name of youngest daughter of Holy Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and how many daughters Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam have?
He had 4 daughters.
And the youngest daughter's name was Sayyidah Fatima Az-Zahra radiallahu ta'ala anha.
Great, MashaAllah. Who is the first lady interred in Islam?
Sayyidah Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha.
MashaAllah. What are the name of son of Holy Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's?
Sayyidina Qasim, Sayyidina Abdullah, Sayyidina Ibrahim radiallahu anhu.
MashaAllah, right answer. When Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was in Baytul Muqaddas at the journey of Miraj, so who lead the prayer in Baytul Muqaddas, and what was the gift that he was given by Allah Ta'ala in this journey?
Can you please repeat the question?
Sorry? Yeah. Who lead the prayers when Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was in the journey, and what was the gift that he was given by Allah Ta'ala in this journey?
Our Holy Prophet ﷺ led the prayers to all the prophets, peace be upon them, and the gift that he got was
5 times daily salah.
MashaAllah. MashaAllah. Last. When and where Holy Prophet Sallallahu Ta'ala Alaihi Wasallam got first revelation?
Can you please repeat the question?
When means when and where Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam got first revelation?
He was 40 years old and it was at the Cave of Hira.
Can you please repeat the question once more?
When and where our Holy Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam got first revelation, Wahi?
Our Holy Prophet ﷺ, in the cave of Hira, he got his first revelation.
And he was 40 years old.
Right answer. MashaAllah. MashaAllah, you have 10 out of 10.
Okay? Good job. Give it to them. इसमें बहुत नए क्वेश्चन है अगर हम बहुत
Okay, first question for you. To follow the Holy Quran and Sunnah so that we can be good people and please Allah and the Holy Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So basically we have to follow. Okay, so the question is now, can you tell any three name of Sayyidina An-Nabi Sallallahu Ta'ala Alaihi Wasallam with the meaning?
Muhammad, the praised one, Amin, the honest one, Sadiq, the truthful one.
MashaAllah, right answer. What is the name of Holy Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's father and his grandfather?
His father's name is Hazrat Abdullah radiallahu ta'ala anhu, and his grandfather's name is Hazrat Abdul Muttalib radiallahu ta'ala anhu.
MashaAllah, right answer. What is the third month of Islamic calendar?
Rabi al-Awwal.
MashaAllah. When our Holy Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's father and mother and his grandfather passed away from this world?
Can you repeat the question?
When our Holy Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's father, mother and grandfather passed away from this world?
His father passed away several weeks before his birth. His mother passed away when he was 8 years old.
And his grandfather passed away when he was 8 years old?
What you said, Mahak? I didn't hear.
His mother passed away when he was 6 years old.
Just yeah.
His mother passed away when he was 6 years old.
Okay, right answer. Okay. Okay. What is the name of first wife of Holy Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and what is the name of youngest wife of Holy Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam?
Sayyidina Khadija Tul-Kubra radiallahu anha.
And Sayyidina Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha.
MashaAllah. Name any three battles and one battle in which Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam did take a part.
Can you repeat the question?
Name any three battles of Islam and one battle especially in which Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam took a part.
Battle of Uhud, Battle of Badr,
Battle of Badr, Battle of Ahad, and Battle of Khandaq. And the Holy Prophet took part of the Battle of Badr.
MashaAllah, right. Okay. Yeah. What was the age of Sayyidina Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam when he migrated from Mecca to Medina, and how long he stayed in Medina?
He stayed in Medina for 10 years, and when he migrated, he was 53 years old.
Right. देखिए जाके भाई कुछ निकालें.
Okay, so tell me the night in which Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam led the prayer for all the prophets, and tell me in the Masjid Aqsa, and tell me the horse-like animal which he sallallahu ta'ala wasallam used to do that journey.
Can you repeat the question?
Tell me the name of the night in which Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala wasallam led the prayer of all the prophets in Masjid Aqsa, and tell me the name of the horse-like animal which he sallallahu ta'ala wasallam used on that night.
The horse-like animal is Burak, and the night is.
And Beit al-Maqdis?
That's the wrong answer.
They have 10 hour right time, and so the next group. Okay, so from there, Mubi's group won. Okay, from this one. Okay, who is the next one? Jalli karo. Madina's group, come forward, please. Madina, Zahid.
And who is your
Who is your partner, Madina? Where is Raisa? Okay, go ahead. Let's go. And Ahmad Hussain and Muhammad Zahid. तो फिर मदीना तो रईसा के साथ कौन है? नहीं, मदीना जाहिद तो क्लास 6 में है ना ये तो। अच्छा, तो उनके साथ कौन है फिर? ये अहमद और मोहम्मद जाहिद के अगेंस्ट में कौन होगा? रईसा किसके साथ है? उन्होंने ग्रेड 7 का प्रैक्टिस किया, तो इनको फिर किसके साथ? नहीं, वो ग्रेड 7 में प्रैक्टिस करेंगे, तो ये किसके साथ करेंगे? ऐसा नहीं। कम अपने पहले से बोला था। Okay. So there is little confusion. Sit down, Madina. You sit down. There is little confusion. So what we gonna do? You're gonna play against Fiza group again. They will have another chance, and whoever will win, they will go for the against the Mubashira and Nazifa, Jeba. Okay? Okay. So we'll start from you, okay? Muhammad. Okay? Take a mic. हाँ, उन्होंने पहले से बोला नहीं कि उन्होंने वो नजीफा इंडिया से आई तो सब चीज। Ready, Ahmed? Ready? चार थी, उन्होंने वो चेंज किया। How many daughters of Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and what is the name of the youngest daughter of our Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam?
There are 4 daughters of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the youngest one is Sayyidatina Fatima radiallahu anhum.
Speak loudly, okay? What is the name? What is the name of the first wife of our Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and what is the name of our Holy Prophet's wife who had never married before?
Sayyida Khadija radiallahu anha and Sayyida Aisha radiallahu anha.
MashaAllah. What are the names of the sons? Name of the sons of our Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Sayyidina Qasim radiallahu anhu Sayyidina Abdullah radiallahu anhum, and Sayyidina Ibrahim radiallahu anhum.
MashaAllah. And what are the names of four daughters of our Holy Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam?
Sayyidatina Zainab radiallahu anha, Sayyidatina Ruqayya radiallahu anha, Sayyidatina Kulthum radiallahu anha, and Sayyidatina Fatima radiallahu anha.
When the first revelation of the Quran, the Wahi came, and where, and to whom our Prophet sallallahu ta'ala wasallam told about it.
Can you repeat the question?
When and where the first revelation of Quran came, and to whom very first Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam informed about it.
It happened when the Prophet ﷺ was 40 years old. It happened at the cave of Hira, and he told his first experience of the revelation to Sayyidah Khadija radiallahu anha.
MashaAllah, MashaAllah. Very good. Give the names of his two blessed grandsons of our Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein radiallahu anhu.
MashaAllah. So when the first revelation came at cave of Hira, how many wells came over there? And when angel Jibril came, so what he did and how many times he did to do some act, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam?
He revealed 5 verses. He brought the message from Allah Ta'ala to the Prophet ﷺ, and he asked the Prophet to read 3 times.
MashaAllah, MashaAllah. Very good. What is the duty of every Muslim?
To follow the Quran and Sunnah so we can become good people and please Allah Ta'ala and the Holy Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam.
1 week only. Yeah. 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 Can you tell me any 3 names of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam with its meaning?
Muhammad, the praised one, Amin, the honest one, and Sadiq, the truthful one.
MashaAllah.
Say it loudly, please.
Give me the name of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's father, mother, grandfather, uncle, and foster mother's name.
Can you repeat the question?
Please give the name of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's father, mother, uncle, grandfather, and his foster's mother name.
Hazrat Abdullah radiallahu anhum, Hazrat Amina radiallahu anha, Abu Talib is his uncle, Hazrat Abdul Muttalib, and Sayyidah Halima Sadiya radiallahu anha.
MashaAllah, you did very excellent job, and 10 of 10 you did right, okay? MashaAllah. Okay. Fiza, let's go faster, beta. Let's go. कहाँ घुमा के पूछा लेकिन हिला नहीं. So they did all 10 right, Fiza. Again, the same thing, right? So if anyone wrong, you out, okay? Again, you have, by luck, you got second chance, but I'm telling you, you have to 100% perfect.
Guys, quiet, please.
So, what was the first revelation at the cave of Hira? And what angel Jibril asked Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and how many times he asked to do that?
The first revelation at the cave of Hira was
Ikra bismi rabbika allazi khalaq. Angel Jibreel asked our Holy Prophet to read 3 times.
MashaAllah, very good, beta. Give me the name of the 4 daughters of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the 2 sons' name. 2 grandsons' name.
Sayyida Fatima radiallahu anha, Sayyida Khadija, Sayyida Ruqayya radiallahu anha, Sayyida Kulsum radiallahu anha, and Sayyida Zainab radiallahu anha. And the grandsons' names are Sayyida Imam Hussein radiallahu anhuma and Sayyidina Imam Hassan radiallahu anhu.
Give me the name of 4 imams and 3 friends of Allah. Wali Allah's name.
The 4 Imams are Imam Shafi, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Hanbal, and Imam Malik. And the 3 Waliullah are Goshe Pak, Hazrat Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani, Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti, and Dara Ganj Baksh.
MashaAllah. Recite 2nd kalima and 3rd kalima with its meaning.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu wa ashhadu anna abduhu wa rasuluhu. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that there is none worthy of worship besides Allah, and I bear witness that that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the messenger and servant of Allah.
So I am Kalimat Tamjid, Subhanallah, walhamdulillah, wa la ilaha illallah, wa la akbar, wa la hawla, wa la quwwata illa billah al-aliyyil azim. Glory be to Allah, and all praise be to Allah. There is no worthy of worship besides Allah. Allah is the greatest. There is no power and might except for Allah, the Most High, the Great.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu wa ashhadu anna abduhu wa rasuluhu. I bear witness that there is none worthy of worship besides Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the servant and messenger of Allah.
You made mistakes, beta. Sorry for that, okay? So you lose again. So we'll start with the 3rd round. Jiba and Mubashira, please come forward. Good job, okay? तो 3rd final का पेपर वहाँ पे ये रहा नहीं कोई नहीं चलेगा एक बात एक आएगा ready बेटा okay so what is the dua after eating when I am eating at my home, and what is the dua after eating when I am eating on the dawat, on invitation?
When you're at home and you're eating, after you say Alhamdulillahi alladhi at'amana wa sakana wa ja'alana minal muslimin, and after meals at an invitation is Allahumma barik lahum fima razaqtahum waghfir lahum warhamhum.
MashaAllah. Recite Surah Hamaza.
Pardon?
Recite Suratul Humazah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ويل لكل همزة لمزة الذي جمع مالا وعدده أيحسب أن ماله أخلده كلا ينبذن في الحطمة وما أدراك ما الحطمة نار الله موقدة التي تطلع على الأفئدة إنها عليهم موصدة في أمد ممددة.
You did some part wrong, so this is wrong answer. You can check it with your teacher, please. Yeah. Recite Ayatul Kursi.
الله لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم لا تأخذه سنة ولا نوم له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض من ذا الذي يشفع عنده إلا بإذنه يعلم ما بين أيديهم وما خلفهم ولا يحيطون بشيء من علمه إلا بما شاء وسع كرسيه السماوات والأرض ولا يؤوده حفظهما وهو العلي العظيم.
MashaAllah, right answer. While I was looking in the mirror, I was doing one dua. I got a message from someone. He was telling somebody from Muslim community passed away. What are those dua that I have to do in that time?
When you're looking in the mirror, you pray, Allahumma anta hasanta khalki fahasan khalki.
And when you heard the news that somebody passed away, then you say, Inna lillahi wa inna ilaihi raji'un.
MashaAllah, right. Recite Suratul Kafirun.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل يا أيها الكافرون لا أعبد ما تعبدون ولا أنتم عابدون ما أعبد ولا أنا عابد ما عبدتم ولا أنتم عابدون ما أعبد لكم دينكم ولي دين.
MashaAllah, right answer. Okay. What is Iman?
The person who leads namaz.
Sorry?
The person who leads namaz.
What is Iman?
Iman, not imam. Iman.
Iman with N at the end.
Six, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Okay, wrong. Say 12 Islamic month and tell us what is the month in which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam born.
Muharram, Safar, Rabiul Awal, Rabiul Thani, Jamadil Awal, Jamadil Thani, Rajab, Shaban, Ramadan, Shawwal, Zilqa'dah and Zilhajj. And the month that our Holy Prophet ﷺ was born is Rabiul Awal.
MashaAllah, right. Tell us 3 sacred night, holy nights, and tell us in which month and date they come.
Shab-e Qadr, Laylatul Qadr, 27th Ramadan, Shab-e Barat, 15th Shaban, and Shab-e Miraj, 27th Rajab.
MashaAllah. Right. Recite Imane Mujmal and Imane Mufassal by saying this is Imane Mujmal and this is Imane Mufassal.
Imane Mujmal is Sifati Imane Mujmal, Amantu Billahi Kama Huwa Bi Asma'i wa Sifati wa Qabilku Jamia wa Ahkami wa Arkanihi Iqraram Bilisani wa Tasdiqam Bil Qalb. And Imane Mufassal is Sifati Imane Mufassal, Amantu Billahi wa Malaikatihi wa Kutubihi wa Rusulihi wal Yawmil Akhir wal Qadri Khairihi wa Sharrihi min Allah Ta'ala wal Ba'si Ba'dal Maut.
MashaAllah. Right. Go. Last question. Tell us 4 faraid of wudu. Listen. And 8 at least 2 benefits of keeping wudu.
Washing the face, washing both arms including the elbows, moistening a quarter of the head, and washing both feet including the ankles. And the 2 benefits of keeping wuzu are angels will be enthusiastic to avail his company and the holy pen will
Sorry,
keep on.
once again, this one.
The 4 faraids of wuzu is washing the face, washing both arms including the elbows, moistening a quarter of the head, and washing both feet including the ankles. And the 2 benefits of keeping wuzu is angels will be enthusiastic to avail his company and the holy pen will keep on writing good deeds for him.
MashaAllah, right answer. You got 8 out of 10 right. MashaAllah.
Muhammad, let's go forward.
Muhammad and Ahmad.
Good job.
Okay. First question, Muhammad and Ahmad. MashaAllah. What is Iman and what is Kufr? And give some example of Iman and Kufr.
Everything from what the Holy Prophet ﷺ said, Allah calls Iman.
Can you please just say it loudly by raising your mic onto your mouth, please?
Everything the Holy Prophet ﷺ said, Allah calls Iman.
Sorry, the time is over. While I was looking in the mirror, I was wearing my cloth. Same time, I got a very bad news of passing away of a Muslim. So, what are the dua that we have to do in this case?
When a person passes away, you say Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. It's Allahumma anta santa. When looking in the mirror, it's Allahumma anta santa khalqi fasin khuluqi.
15, 14. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Sorry, time is over. If you get one more question wrong, you will be out. So make sure before you give the answer. Recite Suratul Kafirun.
قل يا أيها الكافرون لا أعبد ما تعبدون ولا أنتم عابدون ما أعبد ولا أنا عابد ما عبدتم ولا أنتم عابدون ما أعبد لكم دينكم ولي دين.
Can you please repeat? I didn't hear clearly. I said just recite loudly by having your mic in front of your mouth, please.
قل يا أيها الكافرون لا أعبد ما تعبدون ولا أنتم عابدون ما أعبد ولا أنا عابد ما عبدتم ولا أنتم عابدون ما أعبد لكم دينكم ولي دين.
Sorry, beta. Sorry, you lose.
Okay, so moving, you guys won, okay? So for class 6, you guys won. Okay, but I sit down. Good job. Okay. So we'll start with class 7. Okay. So first group is
MashaAllah.
and Safa. Please come forward. You're gonna play against Fatima and Joha. Fatima, Mohsin and Joha, come forward too, please. विनर का एक लिस्ट बना दें, विनर का सारी एक पेपर ले लिस्ट बना ले, हम लोग को दे दें। इसमें ये नहीं, चलो ये सब लिख दे दो फटाफट। सब कुछ नाम लिखने कौन सा ये तंजील और सफा और sorry, Tanjil and Safa playing against Raisa and Madina. My mistake, sorry. Okay, go forward. So this is the question and answer regarding the family of Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala wasallam, and it's include Hazrat Fatima Zohra radiallahu ta'ala anha, Hazrat Khadija, Hazrat Aisha and Hazrat Ali. Right? MashaAllah, very good. So we'll start with Tanjil group, okay? What is the name of Hazrat Aisha's mother?
Sayyida Ummi Iruman.
MashaAllah, very good. How many ahadith of our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam did Hazrat Aisha narrate?
Can you please repeat the question?
How many ahadith from our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam did Hazrat Aisha narrate?
3.
Wrong answer. When did Hazrat Aisha pass away?
On Tuesday, 17th of Ramadan.
MashaAllah. Why did Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam tell Hazrat Ali to sleep on his bed when he was leaving from Makkah to Medina?
Because the Quraysh were gonna attack him on that night.
Because
Can you repeat the question?
why did Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam tell Hazrat Ali to sleep on his bed when he was leaving from Makkah to Medina?
The Quraysh were mad at our Prophet for leaving their group, so they wanted to attack the Prophet, but Allah Ta'ala commanded our Prophet not to stay. So our Prophet went to Medina and told Hazrat Ali to sleep on his bed for that night.
Why did Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala wasallam tell Hazrat Ali to sleep on his bed when he was leaving from Makkah to Medina?
It was a command by Allah Ta'ala.
Wrong answer.
Okay, beta. Just one more time. When you want a clarification from us, you can ask. Once you have done the answer, that would be right or wrong, final answer. Okay? Yes.
Who are the most excellent of all women of Jannah?
Hazrat Fatima.
It's not completed. Answer is not completed.
Hazrat Fatima Zahra radiallahu ta'ala anha.
Sayyida Aisha.
Not completed yet.
Sayyida Aisha Siddiqa.
What is the name of Hazrat Khadija's father? Next question. How long was Hazrat Khadija married to our beloved Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam?
Can you repeat the question?
How long was Hazrat Khadija married to our beloved Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam? कितने साल तक वो शादी में रही?
6 years?
Wrong answer. What was the title given to Hazrat Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhu?
Karamallahu ta'ala wajhahul kareem.
Right answer. Where was our Holy Prophet sallallahu ta'ala wasallam staying in the Medina?
Can you repeat the question?
Where was our Holy Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam staying in Medina when he migrated to Medina?
He stayed in Cuba, then went to Medina.
At Cuba.
Yeah.
Right answer. Who attacked Hazrat Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhu with her sword?
Ibni Muljim.
Right answer. Okay, so you have 5 right and 5 wrong, beta. Okay, mashallah, well done. I know it's hard, but we have to. So you're gonna be more practice next time. Okay, Jazakallah for participating. And now give it to the Isa and the Medina. Who led the funeral prayer of Hazrat Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha?
Hazrat Abu Hurairah radiallahu ta'ala.
MashaAllah. How did Hazrat Aisha obtain the knowledge of medicine and healing illness?
During the last stages of the Prophet ﷺ's life, he was very sick, and foreign doctors would send her medicine, and he would treat him.
Right answer, beta. Who was the first lady of the Hashmi tribe to accept Islam?
Hazrat Khadijatul Kubra radiallahu ta'ala. Wait,
Wrong answer, beta.
Think before you speak.
What did the people of Makkah refer to Hazrat Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha?
they would call her Tahira, meaning pure one.
MashaAllah, very good. Who are the most excellent of all women of Jannah?
Fatima radiallahu Sayyidah Fatima radiallahu ta'ala radiallahu anha, Hazrat Aisha radiallahu anha, Hazrat Maryam radiallahu anha, and Hazrat Khadija radiallahu anha.
Excellent, MashaAllah, very right answer. Which wife's face was presented in the silk cloth at Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala wasallam by Hazrat Jibreel alayhi salam?
Hazrat Aisha radiallahu ta'ala.
MashaAllah, very good. Right answer, beta. How many ahadith from our beloved Prophet sallallahu ta'ala wasallam did Hazrat Aisha narrated?
2,210.
MashaAllah, very good. You won the competition for this round. Okay. Jazakallah for participating. Well done. Who was there? Tanzil and that. Well done, and you guys also well done. Okay, beta, sit down, please. Okay, next group. Fatima Mohsin Johar 6 against Mahinur and Iman Fatima. Okay, Fatima, you are okay. So come this side. Okay, I won't repeat the question. If you have a problem in the question to understand or you didn't listen me properly, you can ask me again. Okay, but there is a multiple answer of the questions. So you have, if you want complete that multiple answers, if you say part of that answer, it won't count as a right answer. Okay, mashallah.
Once you said the answer, that would be final answer. Okay, so think before you say anything.
How old was Hazrat Fatima radiallahu ta'ala anha when she got married?
She was 16 years old.
Wrong answer. How old was Hazrat Khadija when she passed away?
She was 65 years old.
Right answer, beta. Who was the first lady of the Hashmi tribe to accept Islam?
Hazrat Aisha Siddiqa radiallahu ta'ala.
Wrong answer. What was the Hazrat Khadija's mother name?
Fatima bin Zaidah.
MashaAllah, very good, beta. Right answer. What was the Hazrat Aisha highly skilled in?
She was highly skilled in the field of medicine. She was highly skilled in the field of medicine.
MashaAllah, very good. What is the name of Hazrat Fatima radiallahu ta'ala anha's mother and father?
Can you repeat the question?
What is the name of Hazrat Fatima radiallahu ta'ala anha's father and mother?
Her father's name is Hazrat Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and her mother's name was Hazrat Khadija al-Kubra radiallahu anha.
MashaAllah. How old was Hazrat Ali when he accepted Islam?
He was 8 to 10 years old.
MashaAllah, you prepare very well, beta. What's happening today is different today. She prepared very well. MashaAllah, very good.
MashaAllah.
Where was our Holy Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam staying at Medina?
Can you repeat it?
Where was our Holy Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam staying at Medina?
Hazrat Aisha's place?
Wrong answer, beta. What is the name of Hazrat Khadija's father?
Khuwailid bin Ash.
MashaAllah, very good. MashaAllah. What is the name of Hazrat Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha's mother?
Ruman.
MashaAllah. Okay. So you have 7 right, 3 wrong. Okay, beta? Okay, pass it to them.
Okay, so before you say, you have to think. Once you said the answer, that would be final answer. If you wanna ask us for clarification, you can ask. The question, first question is, who led the funeral prayer of Hazrat Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha? Guys, please keep quiet. Keep quiet, please.
Hazrat Huraira.
Sorry. For how long timing Hazrat Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anhu is staying in the marriage of Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam?
$25 years.
Sorry.
Listen the question properly, okay?
Who are the most excellent of all women of Jannah?
Hazrat Khadija, Hazrat Maryam, Hazrat Asiya, and Hazrat Fatima.
Yeah, right. MashaAllah. For how long timing Hazrat Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha did stay in the marriage of Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam?
$25 years.
Yeah, right answer. MashaAllah. Question is, why did Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam tell Hazrat Ali to sleep on his bed when he was leaving from Mecca to Medina? Thirty second.
Wait. Hazrat Ali, radiallahu ta'ala anhu,
Raise the mic, please.
and who said that I will be sleeping on your bed by Allah's command. You will be sleep.
So Allah commanded Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to go to.
Sorry, time is over, beta.
We were discussing. I didn't say
When did Hazrat Aisha pass away from this world?
Can you repeat the question?
The question is, when did Sayyida Aisha radiallahu anha pass away from this world?
Tuesday, 17th Ramadan.
Yeah, mashallah, right answer. Which of the wife of all wives of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam proposed marriage to himself?
Can you repeat the question?
Which of the wife of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam proposed marriage to himself?
Sayyidina Khadijatul Kubra.
Right answer. Where was our Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam staying in Medina?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Where was our Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam staying in Medina?
He was staying in Sayyidina Kulsum's house.
Second.
Sayyidina Kulsum's house with anha.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Sorry, the time is over. It's done? Okay, sorry, you lose the competition because you have done 4 wrong and the other party has done 3 wrong, so they have gained more than you the number. Sorry for that. Party up. Reha Bungar Faiza Master with Fatima Mubarak and Sana Patel. Same class, right? They have same class, right? Okay. First question for you, Reha and Faiza. Who was the first person in Islam whose funeral bier was covered from Abu?
Hazrat Fatima al-Zahra radiallahu anha.
MashaAllah, right answer. Okay. For how long period Hazrat Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha got a chance to be in the marriage of Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam?
25 years.
Sorry, wrong answer. How many ahadith from our Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam did Hazrat Aisha narrate?
2,210.
Right answer. MashaAllah. Who was the first and last wife of our Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam?
The first is Khadija Tul Kubra, and the last is. And I think the last one is Aisha.
Right answer. Okay. Why did Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam tell Hazrat Ali to sleep on his bed when he was leaving from Makkah to Medina?
He asked Hazrat Ali this because the Quraysh were going to attack him at this night, and Allah Ta'ala had commanded him to leave.
Again, please.
He left, he told Hazrat Ali to sleep in his bed because Allah Ta'ala had commanded him to leave, and the Quraysh were going to attack him this very night.
Sorry, beta. Wrong answer. This is also could be answered, but the answer that is given in the book, we need actually exact answer. Shh. Excuse me, guys. Please be quiet and be listening to all these girls. You might get some benefit from their question and answer. I don't want anyone to speak right here. Otherwise, I'll just take the person away from this area. Be quiet, please. Who was the first youngster to accept Islam?
Hazrat Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhu.
Right. What is the name of father of Hazrat Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha and mother?
Her father's name was Hazrat Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anha, and her mother's name was Ruman.
Yes, right. क्वेश्चन आंसर यही है सिर्फ, और कुछ भी है, ये पेपर है सिर्फ, और कुछ भी है। Who was the first lady of the Hashmi tribe to accept Islam?
Fatima bin Asad bin Hashim.
MashaAllah, right answer. कितना हो गया शो? 2 more? Okay. When did Hazrat Ali pass away from this world?
He passed away from this earth on the 11th of Ramadan, 40 AH.
Sorry?
11th of Ramadan, 40 AH.
Sorry. Wrong answer. What was the name of Hazrat Ali's oldest son?
May you please repeat the question?
What was the name of Hazrat Ali's oldest son? Oldest.
Hazrat Hassan radiallahu ta'ala anha.
Yes, right answer, beta. You got 7 out of 10. So the mic will go to Fatma and Sana. You know the rule, beta. The question will not be repeated again and again unless and until you need a clarification for question. Once you have done the answer, that answer will be final answer, right or wrong. So make sure before you speak, you have a time for 40 seconds to discuss with your friend. So here's the question. Who is the leader of all ladies in paradise?
Hazrat Fatima Zahra radiallahu anha.
Right, mashallah. Who was the only unmarried lady for Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam to get married?
Hazrat Aisha radiallahu ta'ala.
Mashallah, right answer. How old was Hazrat Khadija radiallahu anha when she passed away from this world?
$65.
MashaAllah, right answer. Why did Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam tell Hazrat Ali to sleep on his bed when he was leaving from Makkah to Medina?
He had told Hazrat Ali to sleep on his bed because he knew that the Quraysh wanted to kill him, Allah Ta'ala had told Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to migrate to Medina.
You have
And
10 seconds.
after the Prophet told Hazrat Ali that he had to
Sorry, beta. I know there could be some few answer of one question, but because we have given you the book and the book has very specific answer, so we need actually that specific answer. Sorry for that. Make sure you are not just pulling the mic like this here and there. Okay? Sorry for that. Yeah, you are doing good. Who was the first lady of the Hashmi tribe to accept Islam?
Fatima bin Asad bin Hashim.
Fatima bint Asad bint Hashim.
Mike, please.
Fatima bint Asad
Yes,
bint
right
Hashim.
answer. She said first Fatima bin.
Oh.
Where was our Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam staying in Medina after he migrated from Makkah to Medina?
Our Prophet had stayed in Quba.
Second.
Our Prophet had stayed in Quba.
10 more seconds.
Kulsum's house.
Yes, right. You are lucky. In very last second you said Kulsum's house. You said first at Cuba, so that was the part of answer, but there's added answer at the house of Kulsum. Yes. Last. Yeah, we have four. When did Hazrat Ali pass away from this world?
Hazrat Ali passed away on the 17th of Ramadan, 40 AH.
Great, mashallah. What was Hazrat Khadija's mother's name?
Hazrat Fatima bin Zaidah.
Yes, right. Who attacked Hazrat Ali with a sword?
Quraysh.
Sorry, wrong. No.
Both have the same right answer.
Right.
If you do right answer, you will win. If you go, then you go to tiebreak. Okay? The tiebreak will be more harder. Just think before you reply.
क्या पूछ लें? What was Hazrat Aisha radiallahu anha highly skilled in?
She was highly skilled in the physical science of medicine.
Wrong answer, sorry beta. So it's a tie.
It's a tie. Okay, who has a tie? Who is that against me? Come forward, please.
Reha and
We're gonna ask you both a 5-5 question, okay?
Okay.
Okay, Sana. Well, Sana hai aapka. Oh, interest of conflict. Recite Iman Mufassal, Iman Mujmal with the name, okay?
Pardon?
Recite Iman Mufassal and Iman Mujmal with the name. Which one is which one?
إيمان مفصل آمنت بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسوله واليوم الآخر والقدر خيره وشره من الله وتعالى والبعث بعد الموت.
And Iman Mufassal, no, Iman Mujmal is
إيمان مجمل آمنت بالله كما هو بأسمائه وصفاته وقبلت جميع أحكامه وأحكامه إقرارا باللسان وتصديقا بالقلب.
Yeah, you made it almost. Okay. Can you read Ayatul Kursi for me? Ayatul Kursi.
الله لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم لا تأخذه سنة ولا نوم له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض من ذا الذي يشفع إنه إلا بإذنه يعلم ما بين أيديهم وما خلفهم إلا بما شاء وسع كرسيه السماوات والأرض ولا يهده حفظهما وهو العلي العظيم.
No, it was wrong. You missed some portion of it. Okay. Oh, God. Okay. Read the dua when we read when we listen to any bad news, and the dua we read while looking in the mirror.
اللهم أنت أحسنت خلقي فأحسنت خلق.
Okay. Tell me the names of any 5 prophets and the 4 famous books and on which prophets they were revealed.
So, Hazrat Muhammad Mustafa Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, Hazrat Isa, Hazrat Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam had gotten the Quran. Hazrat Isa Alayhi Salam had gotten the Torah revealed on Injil Alayhi Salam. Hazrat Musa Alayhi Salam had got the Hazrat Isa Alayhi Salam had gotten
Okay. Name any 3 Wali Allah, friends of Allah, and 4 Imams, please. Name of 4 Imams.
Imam Shafi, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, and Imam Hanbal.
the 3 Wali Allahs is Gospak, Hazrat Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, Gospak radiyallahu ta'ala anhu,
Gause Pak, Hazrat Qadir Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani, and Dada Ganjpak. And Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti.
Okay, so you have 2 right.
2 correct. Okay. Give mic to them. Okay. Read Surah Kafirun, please. Read Surah Kafirun.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل يا أيها الكافرون لا أعبد ما تعبدون ولا أنتم عابدون ما أعبد ولا أنا عابد ما عبدتم ولا أنتم عابدون ما أعبد لكم دينكم ولي دين.
Okay. Dua we read when before going to the washroom and after coming from washroom.
Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-khubuthi wal-khaba'ith and leaving Ghufranaka alhamdulillah alladhi azhabana al-wafani.
Good, mashallah. Read 3rd and 4th kalma with the meaning.
سويم كلمة تمجيد سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Glory be to Allah and all praise be to Allah. There is none worthy of worship besides Allah, and Allah is the greatest. There is no power and might except from Allah, the Most High, the Great. Charm kalima tawheed, la ilaha illallah, wahdahu la sharika lahu, lahul mulku wa lahul hamdu, yuhyi wa yumitu biyadihil wa huwa ala kulli shay'in qadir. There is no God but Allah. He is one and is His partner. He is the sovereignty. He gives life and causes death. He is ever living. Death will never come unto Him. In Him is all goodness, and He is able to do all things. There is no God but Allah. He is one and is His partner. He is the sovereignty. There is no He gives life and causes death. He is ever living. Death will never come unto Him. In Him is all goodness, and He is able to do all things. The meaning? There is no God but Allah. He is one, none is His partner. He is the sovereignty. Death will never come unto Him. He gives life and causes death. He is ever living. Death will never come unto Him. He is in Him is all goodness, and He is able to do all things. there is no God but Allah. There is no God but Allah. He is one, none is his partner. He is the sovereignty. He gives life and causes death. He is ever living. Death will never come onto him. In him is all goodness, and he is able to do all things.
Okay, you're right. Okay, so you guys want for 3 questions, so I'll get them. So we're gonna continue tomorrow. Tomorrow will be a pizza day, okay? So everybody will be pizza, okay?
الصلاة والسلام عليك يا رسول الله وعلى آلك وصحبك يا حبيب الله. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح.